In this video, we're going to see differences between how Python and Java represent various types of data in memory. In Python, when we assign a value to a variable, we're not really storing that value in the variable. Instead, the value is somewhere else in memory, and the variable stores the memory address of the value. So for example, if we're storing the integer 7 in the variable x, 7 is somewhere in memory. Let's say it's at memory location 4001. What's really going to be in the variable x is that memory address. We say that the variable stores a reference to its value. So the memory address is also known as a reference. It's also sometimes referred to as a pointer. Because we don't actually know the memory address and don't care about it, we use an arrow typically when we're trying to depict this situation in which the variable holds a reference to its value. Now, strictly speaking, this is what is always happening in Python. Variables are always holding references to their values. However, for certain types of values, integers, floats, strings, and other values whose internals are immutable, we can picture the value as being inside the variable, and that simplifies our mental model. So for example, if we are storing an integer in a variable, we can picture that integer as being inside the variable itself. This will have no impact on our conclusions about what's going to happen, provided that it's one of these special types of values whose internals cannot be changed. Now, in Java, some types of data actually are stored inside their variables. So in particular, ints are stored in the variable itself. That's not a simplification of what's going on. That's actually what's going on. So there is no reference for things like ints. And these types of values are referred to as primitive types. And int is one of those primitive types in Java, so is long, double, Boolean, and then there are a few others that we'll talk about later in the course. If something is not a primitive, it is an object. And if you remember, what that means is it's a construct that groups together one or more pieces of data, those are the fields of the object or the attributes, along with one or more functions or methods that belong to that object. So for example, strings are objects. They group together the characters that belong to the string, the length of the string, potentially some other bookkeeping, and then methods that belong to that string object and that can be used to manipulate it. Every object is referred to as an instance of its class, so string objects are instances of the string class, and we can define our own classes if we want to be able to have new types of objects. Now in Python, everything is an object, but that's not true in Java. In Java, primitive values are just single values. They're not objects. So for example, an int is just a set of bits that represents that integer. There's nothing else grouped with it. And that's why it is very easy to put them inside their variables because they only use a small number of bytes. Now, Java does store objects the same way that Python does. So if we have a string, because a string is an object, and we're storing it in a variable, that string object is going to be somewhere in memory, and then what's going to be in the variable is a reference to that object. So this is the same thing that happens with Python, and we're going to use the same way of depicting it in Java. Data types that work this way in Java are known as reference types, and variables of those types are reference variables. Now, why do we have to declare variables in Java? Well, one reason is because we are storing primitives inside their variables, and different primitive values require different amounts of memory. And it depends on the type. So every int in Java is 4 bytes, every double is 8 bytes, so is a long, and then Boolean values are only 1 byte. And so when we declare our variables, we're telling the compiler how much memory is needed for that variable because it has to be able to be big enough to store the actual value, the actual primitive value. So for example, if I'm using a variable called count, I declare it to be of type int if I want it to store an int, and that way the box will be 4 bytes. If I have a variable of type double, then the box will be twice as large. It'll be 8 bytes, and therefore it will be able to store a double. Now in Python, everything's an object, and therefore all variables are the same size because they're all holding memory addresses, references. And therefore we don't need to declare the variable because every variable is the same size. Whether it's an int or whether it's a double or a float is what the term is in Python, they're all going to be the same size because what's really in there is not the value itself, but the memory address of the value.